So today's reading is from John chapter 6, verses 35 to 44. Then Jesus declared, "I am the bread of life. He who comes to me will never go hungry, and he who believes in me will never be thirsty. But as I told you, you have seen me, and still you do not believe. All that the Father gives me will come to me, and whoever comes to me I will never drive away. For I have come down from heaven not to do my will, but to do the will of him who sent me. And this is the will of him who sent me, that I will lose none of all that he has given me, but raise them up on the last day. For my Father's will is that everyone who looks to the Son and believes in him shall have eternal life, and I will raise him up at the last day." At this the Jews began to grumble about him, because he said, "I am the bread and came down from heaven." They said, "Is this not Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How can he now say, 'I came down from heaven'?" "Stop grumbling among yourselves," Jesus answered. "No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up at the last day."
Thanks, Kathy. I want to welcome both the committed and the curious this morning. It's great to have you in church. Some of us have come because we're committed to Jesus, wanting to worship him. Others of us have come because we are curious about Christianity, exploring faith. And one of the things that you find when you start exploring faith is that there are a whole number of phrases that we have in the English language, that we have in our wider society, that actually are rooted in the Bible. And this morning's passage has one of those little phrases. I became aware of a phrase in John chapter 6, not by reading the Bible, but by going to Twickenham to watch rugby. You see, I was 16 years old, and I went to Twickenham to watch Wales versus England. It was my first international match, and I was very, very excited. I'd got hold of this rare commodity, an international rugby ticket, and I went completely naively as a 16-year-old lad with my England scarf, my England rosette, and I found myself in the Welsh end of the Twickenham Rugby Stadium. I was surrounded by thousands of Welshmen. In fact, immediately around me were a whole bunch of miners who had done the night shift in the pits in South Wales, got on a train and come to London. They were still wearing their mining gear. They had their helmets with the lamps. It was a kind of status symbol thing, really. They had blackened faces, and they stood around me. So I put my rosette in my pocket and kind of just played it discreetly. But it was an amazing experience, because about 10 minutes before this match started, I thought I was with a bunch of rugby fans. I wasn't with a bunch of rugby fans. I was part of a Welsh male voice choir, it turned out. There were these thousands of Welshmen all around me, and they started to sing. And it was astonishing. Bread of heaven. I mean, the whole stadium was shaking. I mean, I instantly wanted to be Welsh. It was just that didn't last long, to be fair, but it was an incredible experience as these thousands of people joined in this song that talked about the bread of heaven. That phrase comes from John chapter 6, and that phrase is going to help us get into what we talk about this morning as I speak about a subject in this series called The Heart of It All, and this morning's title is called Forevermore. So if you're to understand John chapter 6, there are two big ideas from the Old Testament that are hovering around in the background which make John 6 come alive. and they're about the name of God, and they're about the significance of bread to people who are well versed in Jewish Old Testament. And both ideas come from a defining moment in Israel's history that is recorded in the book of Exodus, where the Jews escape slavery in Egypt and they break free. It's it's celebrated in the festival called the Passover. It's the Exodus of the people of Israel. And there are these two ideas, the name of God and the whole thing about bread, that are hovering behind the scenes of John 6. Let me try and explain. So when God reveals himself to Moses and says, Moses, I want you to go to the most powerful man in the world called Pharaoh, and I want you to say to him, let my people go, because there are 400,000 Jews enslaved in Egypt, and basically they run they're the reason for their economic prosperity. Moses, I know you're a shepherd, I know you're 80 years old, but I want you to walk into the court of Pharaoh and say, let my people go. Understandably, Moses wasn't too enamored with that idea, and he came up with a whole load of arguments to try and avoid this horrible responsibility. And as he is losing the argument fairly badly with God, he comes up with another argument. He says, well, who am I going to tell them sent me? And Exodus 3:14 has this wonderful, wonderful, wonderful phrase where God says to Moses, I am who I am. Tell him, I am has sent you. I am has sent you. You see, the thing about a name is that with a name, you get a handle on somebody. You get something of their identity. You also get something of their history and where they belong. It gives you a history and a handle. My name is Andrew Donald Hickford because my father's name was Malcolm Donald Hickford, because my grandfather's name was Francis Donald Hickford. We just got lumped with Donald. It gives you a handle and a history on who I am. You can't get a handle and history on the God who is calling Moses. I am who I am. I am has sent you. Hold on to that idea. The second part that is hovering over the whole of John chapter 6 is this idea about bread. So that when it comes to the crunch point where Israel are going to escape from Egypt, God says to Moses to tell the people of Israel, right, I want you to have a hasty meal. You need to eat this with your coats on, with your staff in your hand, with your bags packed. You want to kill a lamb, and you're going to eat it as a family. You're going to put the blood of the lamb over the doorpost, so when the angel of death passes over you, they'll know that you're God's people. And then you're to make some bread. You don't have time to put dough in the bread. It's going to be unleavened bread. This is going to be a symbol forever of God saving you. And every Passover meal that was celebrated every year after that first Passover, for 7 days, there wasn't allowed to be any dough in the house. They had this unleavened bread. Bread became a symbol of God saving his people. And then when they went out of Egypt and into the desert, God miraculously fed the people of Israel with manna and quail. And though manna wasn't actually bread, it became associated in popular Jewish thought as the bread of heaven. And so they looked on bread as this symbol both of God's miraculous saving and God's miraculous provision. That's what bread began to symbolize for Jewish people. And then in popular thought, as they looked to the past, they would also look to the future. And when they thought about the Messiah, the one who was going to rescue them, in popular thought, and it's written in a number of places, that the Messiah was going to bring more bread from heaven. There would be this miraculous saving and provision for God's people. So all of those things are floating in the background for John chapter 6. And at the start of John chapter 6, Jesus feeds 5,000 people with two loaves and 5 fishes. Is that the right way around? Yeah. No, 5 loaves, 2 fishes. Thank you very much. So immediately you would think this crowd are going to be thinking the Messiah's come. This one who works miracles with bread, who feeds the crowds. You'd have thought that they would have been really, really excited that in Jesus, the Jewish Messiah has come. Actually, It was exactly the opposite. In verse 26 of John 6, Jesus is really, really disappointed with their attitude. The crowd just don't get it. All this miracle that he's just done has just gone straight over their heads. And Jesus says to them in verse 26, "Truly I tell you, you've come looking for me now, not because you saw the signs I performed, these things that pointed towards his identity, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill." In other words, Jesus is saying, you're only interested in me because with me you get a free lunch. That's what he's saying to them in verse 26. Jesus is really disappointed because he sees that their motive is not devotion to him. They followed him because they fancy some more free food. And so as the conversation continues in John chapter 6, it becomes even more clear that the crowd are completely missing the point. They want more free food, but they want the excitement of another miracle. This is entertainment. This is celebrity. They just weren't getting the significance of who Jesus was. And so they asked him in verse 30, "What sign then will you give us that we may see it and believe you? What are you going to do next? Our ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness. As it's written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat." That's what it says in verse 31. If I'd have been Jesus, I'd have been profoundly disappointed. They just don't get it. Jesus is obviously going to have to work a lot harder and be a lot more blunt with these people to describe who he is. So then comes the big moment where Jesus confronts the crowd with the reality of who they have standing in front of them, where he ties in all that Old Testament understanding about the Passover and the name of God and the significance of bread and the miracle he's just worked, and he brings that all together in verse 35. Look at it there. Then Jesus declared, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." Remember Exodus 3:14? God saying to Moses, "Tell Pharaoh, I am has sent you." The unspeakable name of God, I am who I am, Yahweh. And Jesus says, I am. Remember how bread was a means of God's rescue and provision, a symbol of God's rescue and provision. Jesus says, "I am the bread of life. He who comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." Jesus is saying, I am the means of God's rescue and provision to you. I am the long-awaited Messiah. He's effectively saying, I am talking about a much deeper hunger than your appetite. You will never hunger and thirst again spiritually if you come to me. This is the first time that Jesus uses this I am formula. Rachel mentioned another one where she said, Jesus said, "I am the light of the world." 7 times in John's gospel, Jesus uses that formula. It's a way that John structures his whole gospel. But we're focusing on this one, verse 35. "Whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." Literally, no, not ever. It's a double negative. Jesus is saying that he is the complete satisfaction of everybody's hunger and thirst. It's his completeness that's reflected here. Completely able to satisfy. In verse 36, Jesus challenges the crowd for not being able to see beyond the miracle of the bread to recognize the miracle worker. They were just looking for free food. Another miracle to entertain. It's not triggering in them the faith and love and devotion and trust that Jesus had hoped for. He says in verse 36, he tells them off for it. "But as I told you, you've seen me and you still do not believe." You'd think Jesus would be disappointed. After all, he'd come to seek and save the lost, and the lost clearly aren't getting it. But the crowd are too superficial to realize they need saving. And who is it standing in front of them? Anybody else would have been disheartened. This wasn't going well. But Jesus is not disheartened. In verse 37 to 40, it gives us an insight into the secret resilience that you see in Jesus, a clue to the way he regulated himself mentally and emotionally, his psychological and emotional well-being. We get an insight where it comes from in these next verses. Look at verses 37 to 40. All those the Father gives me will come to me, and whoever comes to me I'll never drive away. For I've come down from heaven not to do my will, but to do the will of him who sent me. And this is the will of him who sent me, that I shall lose none of all these he has given me, but raise them up on the last day. For my Father's will is that everyone who looks to the Son and believes in him shall have eternal life, and I'll raise them up on the last day. It would appear to be that the secret to Jesus' strength and his well-being was that popularity had absolutely no interest to him whatsoever. Success, as people normally define it, was not in any way important to Jesus. Jesus had one thing on his mind, and that one thing was to do the will of his Father. He was totally focused on accomplishing it, even when it meant his own will being subservient to it. Nothing else seems to have mattered to Jesus. As long as he was doing the Father's will, it seems he was peaceful, content, and fulfilled. And what was the Father's will? Well, this is such a profound and important idea that in verses 37 to 40, that Jesus basically says the same thing in different ways to make the point. Let me summarize it like this. In verses 37 to 40 of John 6, Jesus puts it this way. The entire purpose of Jesus coming to earth was to do the will of the Father. And the Father's will is to save the world through his Son. And the way Jesus looked at it was that anyone who believed in him and came to him, those people the Father had given him. And he was now charged with the responsibility to keep those people safe until the end of time, to raise them up on the last day, as it says here a number of times, a reference to the end of history, when a new heaven and new earth will begin, and all those who have died trusting Christ will be raised up to resurrection life with Jesus. So Jesus is totally focused on doing the will of the Father. And that's why he says in verse 37, all those the Father gives to me will come to me, and whoever comes to me I will never drive away. It means literally I will always keep in. He says he will lose none of all that the Father has given him in verse 39. So no wonder Jesus was not too worried about being popular with the crowd. They just wanted free food and celebrity. They wanted to be entertained. Jesus believed he was doing the Father's will when people came to him and believed in him. And that's what he is completely focused on. So let's just push the pause button for a moment. We've got a bit of the Old Testament background to this. We've got a bit of what happened before in John 6, and we've looked at this passage. But we just need to push the pause button and say carefully, what does that passage mean for you and me today? What principles can we extrapolate from it to help us in our own following of Jesus today? There are a couple of things in passing. I don't know about you, but sometimes I think to myself, when I'm talking to people about faith and they don't get it, I think, if only, Jesus, you would be more obvious to them. If only you could give them some kind of sign. If only you would reveal yourself to them. Just do a bit more, Jesus, to make them know that you're real. Well, it's interesting to look at the passage. We sometimes think that if only Jesus could make himself more obvious and work miracles today, people would believe. But people were spiritually blind then too. Here is Jesus working a miracle in front of their eyes, the feeding of the 5,000. Here is Jesus in person speaking to them, and they just don't get it. And Paul described it in 2 Corinthians 4 as a kind of spiritual blindness. He talks about how the world blinds the eyes of unbelievers. So I want to say two things, one to the committed and one to the curious. to the committed here, the most important thing that you can do to share your faith is pray that your friends' eyes would be opened. Nobody's ever persuaded and argued into Christian faith. For those of you here this morning who are curious, I would say that if there is a God, then he transcends all the dimensions of our existence. And so it stands to reason that we will not be able to figure him out on our own. It stands to reason that we will only know something of God if he chooses to reveal himself to us. So as part of the journey of faith, and this is really important to understand, as part of the journey of faith, you need to start praying before you believe. You need to start praying by saying, God, if you're there, I need your help to know you. Now, I know that that can sound manipulative. I can know that that can sound like auto-suggestion. But it stands to reason that if there is a God beyond our dimensions, we're not going to figure him out. We're going to need him to help us. If you are curious, let me invite you to start saying, well, God, if you're there, please reveal yourself to me, because we need his help to know him. The second thing is this. The crowd were following Jesus for what he gave them rather than for who he was. They were following him for the entertainment. They were following him for the free meal. They weren't following him because he was the Messiah. And the truth is, there's something of that in all of us. It's the uncomfortable reality of our human existence, that we come to God because of what he'll give us rather than come to him for who he is. All of us are on that continuum. You know, when I became a Christian because I knew I needed forgiveness. I came to Jesus because of the peace he could bring me. Little wonder I've had so much problems being a disciple ever since. Because it's not about what he can give me, it's about who he's calling me to be, who I can become in him. And so we're all on this continuum. On the one hand, we come like the crowd, come to Jesus because of what he gives us. At the other end of the continuum, we've got phrases in the Bible like in Job chapter 13, where Job just says, "Yet you might slay me, but still I'll trust you." Well, that's pretty hardcore, isn't it? Well, when Jesus said, I give to you my spirit, that who else have I in heaven but you, said Asaph, and earth has nothing I desire besides you. Everything else might be going wrong in my life, but where else have I got to go? You are the way, the truth, and the life. I've found my place in you. Where are you on that continuum? Because I often find that when people go through hard times in their lives, they kind of reject their Christian faith. And often that's an indication that we came to Jesus because of what he could give us rather than who he is. We're all on that continuum. But may it be that our journey would be to, well, who else have I in heaven but you? Where else can I go? You have the words of eternal life. You are Jesus Christ the Lord. Third point, in passing, is that it's really quite interesting that this story picks up a recurring theme in Christianity, which is that the worship of Jesus is a minority view, that it's a narrow way. The popular large crowd didn't get Jesus at all. It was a smaller minority. And there's something here about the nature of church, that it all goes terribly wrong when we're in control of a nation, or where the church is kind of politically influential. We're not supposed to be like that. We're supposed to be this prophetic voice, this light in the darkness, a narrow way, not the broad way. And the story reflects something of that. But I think there's something very profound here about emotional resilience and psychological regulation here. We live in a world where mental and emotional health is a pandemic of monstrous proportions. And here we have Jesus coping with all the pressures and adversity and modeling to us a profound way of being emotionally and psychologically whole. He had one focus: to do the will of the Father. And that kept him sane. He wasn't after popularity. I would hate to be growing up as a teenager in our culture right now, When somebody defines adolescence as when self intrudes everything, you know, like you feel like the whole world is looking at you. That's how I felt when I was 14. I was never 14 like they're 14 today. Their world is saturated with social media that breeds a paranoia that leads to a mental and emotional instability, the likes of which most of us adults have not got our head round. And I see something in this passage here. I used to understand that to want one thing was the route to purity and holiness. One thing I ask of the Lord, this is what I seek, that I will dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life. I pray that prayer every day because I understand that to be totally focused on doing the will of God is the way to holiness and purity. What this passage tells me is it's also the way to sanity and to wholeness and well-being and emotional kind of resonance and resilience, because nothing else matters other than doing the will of God. And for those of you who are curious about Christianity, it's often said that Christianity is a crutch. It's often said that Christianity isn't helpful to individuals or society. But actually what I see here is profoundly helpful, profoundly healthy, because actually all the other opinions begin to diminish. And as we learn to love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, and mind and strength, we end up living for an audience of one. And he's already decided about us. And so once again, we come to that place where we were last week, where we begin to experience this freedom that the love of God brings.